The pitch meeting happened in 1983. Matt and Ross Duffer, not yet born but whose story would one day captivate millions, had an idea for a show. Originally, it was called Montauk, a story about secret government experiments, missing children, and abilities that defied explanation. The setting was Camp Hero, a decommissioned Air Force station at the eastern tip of Long Island, where locals whispered about underground tunnels, strange lights in the sky, and kids who vanished in the early 1980s, only to return years later with no memory of where they'd been. Netflix executives loved everything except the location. Too expensive to film in New York. They moved it to Indiana, renamed it Hawkins, changed the facility to Hawkins Lab, and launched what would become Stranger Things, a global phenomenon about kids with psychic powers, shadow dimensions, and government conspiracies. But here's what they didn't tell you. The Duffer Brothers didn't invent the Montauk Project. They adapted it. Because at Camp Hero, between 1971 and 1983, something actually happened. Something involving children, psychological manipulation, and experiments that survivors claim opened doorways to places human beings were never meant to access. The show you watched as science fiction entertainment, it was based on allegations of real events. Events that military personnel, local residents, and alleged survivors have been trying to expose for over 40 years. Events that the U.S. government has never officially acknowledged, despite documentation, witness testimony, and physical evidence suggesting that Camp Hero was the site of one of the most disturbing classified programs in American history. For decades, the Montauk Project has existed in that uncomfortable space between conspiracy theory and suppressed history, dismissed by mainstream sources as elaborate fiction, yet supported by enough verifiable facts, enough credible witnesses, enough documented anomalies that complete dismissal requires ignoring substantial evidence. The official story is simple. Camp Hero was a Cold War radar station that closed in 1981. The buildings were abandoned, the property was eventually turned into a state park, and nothing unusual ever occurred there. But the unofficial story, the one told by former military personnel, by locals who lived near the base, by people who claim they were experimented on as children, describes something far darker. A continuation of the CIA's MKUltra program, experiments in psychological warfare, mind control, and psychic abilities. The deliberate traumatization of children to induce altered states of consciousness, and according to the most extreme allegations, successful manipulation of time, space, and consciousness itself, resulting in phenomena that sound like science fiction, but that multiple witnesses insist actually occurred. What if the reason Stranger Things resonates so deeply isn't just because it's well-crafted entertainment, but because it taps into something real? What if the Duffer Brothers, in researching Cold War conspiracy theories, stumbled onto documented patterns of government experimentation that actually happened, and what we're calling fiction is simply a sanitized version of events too disturbing to present as fact? What if Camp Hero really was America's Hawkins Lab, and the children who disappeared into its underground tunnels didn't encounter fictional monsters, but something worse? The deliberate cruelty of a government program willing to sacrifice young minds in pursuit of weapons that could control consciousness itself? This is the story the government doesn't want told. The story that's been buried under decades of denial, ridicule, and strategic silence. The story of the Montauk Project and the children who survived it. Camp Hero sits at Montauk Point, the easternmost tip of Long Island, New York. It's a beautiful, desolate place. Windswept beaches, dramatic cliffs, and a landscape that feels separate from the rest of America, isolated and strange. The location was chosen in 1942 for exactly that reason. During World War II, the military needed coastal defense positions, and Montauk Point provided ideal geography for detecting enemy aircraft and submarines. Camp Hero became home to a massive radar installation, including the AN/FPS-35 radar, an enormous dish-shaped antenna housed in a distinctive building that still stands today, visible for miles, looking like something from a science fiction film. The radar was cutting-edge technology, capable of detecting aircraft hundreds of miles away, part of the SAGE defense system that formed America's early warning network against Soviet attack. The base officially operated throughout the Cold War, employing hundreds of military personnel and civilian contractors. According to official records, Camp Hero was deactivated in 1969, with some equipment remaining operational until final closure in 1981. But people who lived in Montauk during those years tell a different story. They describe activity at the base continuing long after official closure. Lights in windows of buildings that were supposedly abandoned. Trucks entering and leaving through gates that were officially locked. Strange sounds echoing across the landscape at night. Mechanical hums, unexplained explosions, and occasionally what residents described as screaming. Children in the area reported seeing other children on the base, usually in groups, being moved between buildings by adults in military uniforms or white coats. Local police occasionally received calls about missing persons who were last seen near Camp Hero, only to have those investigations taken over by federal authorities and quietly closed. The official explanation was always the same. The callers were mistaken, the base was closed, no unusual activity was occurring. But the reports persisted throughout the 1970s and into the early 1980s, creating a local folklore around Camp Hero that painted it as a place of secrets, of things happening that the government didn't want known. The first public allegations about the Montauk Project emerged in 1992 with the publication of The Montauk Project: Experiments in Time by Preston Nichols. Nichols claimed to be a recovered memory survivor of the experiments, an electrical engineer who worked at the base, and was also subjected to mind control programming that suppressed his memories for years. His account, later supported by other alleged survivors including Al Bielek and Duncan Cameron, described a program far beyond conventional military research. According to these witnesses, the Montauk Project was a direct continuation of the Philadelphia experiment, an alleged 1943 Navy experiment that attempted to render ships invisible to radar, but allegedly resulted in teleportation, time distortion, and catastrophic effects on crew members. The Montauk Project, these whistleblowers claimed, built on that technology, using modified radar equipment to manipulate electromagnetic fields in ways that affected human consciousness, time perception, and even physical reality itself. The allegations were extraordinary. Nichols and others described underground facilities beneath Camp Hero, extending multiple levels below the surface, where children and young adults were subjected to psychological programming, sensory deprivation, electromagnetic exposure, and drug-induced altered states. The goal, according to these accounts, was to identify and enhance psychic abilities, primarily what they called manifesting, the ability to create physical reality through focused thought. Children who showed latent psychic potential were recruited, sometimes voluntarily, but often through coercion or outright abduction. They were traumatized deliberately to fragment their consciousness, then programmed to access altered states where their psychic abilities were amplified. At the center of the operation was something called the Montauk chair, a device that allegedly amplified and focused psychic energy, allowing a trained individual to manifest thoughts into reality within a controlled field. The chair was connected to the massive radar equipment, which served as both amplifier and projector, broadcasting the psychic signals in ways that could affect targets at a distance. Mainstream sources immediately dismissed these claims as fantasy, noting the lack of physical evidence, the fantastic nature of the allegations, and the tendency of conspiracy theories to blend real locations with imagined events. But several aspects of the Montauk allegations aligned with documented government programs. MKUltra, the CIA's mind control program, is no longer theory. It's documented fact, confirmed through declassified documents released in the 1970s. MKUltra involved experiments on unwitting subjects, including children, using drugs, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and psychological torture to explore consciousness manipulation and create controllable assets. The program officially ran from 1953 to 1973. But documents show that many MKUltra sub-projects were transferred to military control rather than terminated. Camp Hero, operational and isolated during exactly this period, would have been an ideal location for continued research outside CIA oversight. Additionally, the military's interest in psychic phenomena is documented. The Stargate project, declassified in 1995, confirmed that the U.S. government spent over $20 million investigating remote viewing and psychic espionage between 1975 and 1995. The program employed psychics who claimed ability to perceive distant locations and events through consciousness alone. While the CIA's official assessment concluded that remote viewing had no practical intelligence value, the fact that the program existed for 2 decades and involved serious scientific research demonstrates that the military took psychic phenomena seriously enough to fund extensive investigation. The question isn't whether the government researched psychic abilities. The question is how far that research went, what methods were employed, and what happened to the subjects involved. Preston Nichols's technical background added credibility to some of his claims. He was a legitimate electrical engineer with expertise in radar systems and electromagnetic fields. His descriptions of the equipment allegedly used at Montauk were technically sophisticated, not the ramblings of someone with no understanding of the technology. He described modifications to the AN/FPS-35 radar that would have been possible with 1970s technology, explaining how pulse modulation could be used to influence brainwave patterns, how phased array principles could focus electromagnetic energy, how feedback loops could create resonance effects in human neural tissue. Whether these modifications actually occurred is disputed, but the technical framework he described wasn't science fiction. It was plausible application of existing technology to theoretical effects that were being researched by multiple governments during the Cold War. The child victims are where the allegations become most disturbing and most difficult to verify. Multiple individuals have come forward claiming they were used in Montauk experiments as children. Their accounts share common elements: recruitment or abduction between ages 8 and 16, transportation to underground facilities at Camp Hero, exposure to drug-induced altered states and electromagnetic fields, training in psychic abilities, and deliberate trauma to fragment consciousness and create dissociative states that could be programmed and controlled. Many describe being used in manifesting experiments, where they were placed in the Montauk chair and forced to visualize scenarios while the chair amplified their thoughts, allegedly creating temporary physical manifestations, objects, creatures, even human forms that existed briefly before dissipating. Several survivors describe being part of a Montauk Boys program, a group of psychically gifted children who were kept in a state of partial amnesia, used repeatedly for experiments, and then returned to their normal lives with suppressed memories and significant psychological trauma. The challenge with these testimonies is verification. Most survivors describe being programmed to forget their experiences, with memories only returning years later, often through therapy or spontaneous recall triggered by trauma. This pattern matches documented effects of severe childhood abuse and dissociative disorders, but it also makes the accounts impossible to verify objectively. Skeptics argue that recovered memories are notoriously unreliable, that trauma survivors can internalize suggested narratives, that the Montauk allegations might represent genuine psychological damage being misattributed to fictional events. Supporters point out that ritual abuse and government experimentation have both been documented extensively, that multiple survivors with no connection to each other report identical experiences, and that the consistency of the accounts across decades suggests either coordinated truth or impossibly coordinated fabrication. One survivor, who goes by the pseudonym Stuart Swerdlow, claims extensive memories of Montauk programming. Born in 1960, he alleges being recruited into the program as a child due to psychic abilities and his family's alleged connections to intelligence agencies. His descriptions of the underground facilities are detailed. Multiple levels extending over 10 stories below Camp Hero, connected by elevators and tunnel systems, containing laboratories, holding cells, training rooms, and the central chamber housing the Montauk chair. He describes other children present, some of whom he recognized from local schools, others who he was told came from various locations across the country. The experiments, according to Swerdlow, focused on expanding consciousness to perceive and manipulate what he calls hyperspace, dimensions beyond normal human perception where thought and reality intersect. The chair amplified natural psychic abilities to extreme levels, but the process was traumatic, often causing psychological breakdown, physical illness, and in some cases, death. He claims that many children didn't survive the program, that bodies were disposed of secretly, and that families who questioned disappearances were intimidated or discredited. Swerdlow's account is impossible to verify, and his later involvement in fringe spiritual movements has given skeptics ammunition for dismissal, but elements of his testimony align with documented patterns of institutional abuse and with other survivors' accounts. He describes programming techniques that match MKUltra methodologies: creation of alternate personalities, embedded trigger commands, memory suppression through drugs and hypnosis. He describes facility layouts and security protocols that would be expected in classified military research. And he describes psychological effects, dissociation, time distortion, identity fragmentation that are consistent with extreme trauma. Whether his memories represent literal truth, symbolic processing of real abuse, or elaborated fantasy remains disputed. But the pain in his testimony is genuine, and that pain, shared across multiple alleged survivors, demands attention regardless of whether every detail is literally accurate. The physical evidence at Camp Hero is both tantalizing and inconclusive. The base itself still exists, now part of Camp Hero State Park, open to the public but with large sections officially off limits. The massive radar tower is still visible, though officially inactive. But visitors and researchers have documented several anomalies. Multiple tunnel entrances exist around the property, most now sealed with concrete but some still accessible. Urban explorers who've entered these tunnels describe extensive underground spaces, corridors, rooms, equipment left behind, graffiti from multiple eras suggesting ongoing access long after official closure. Some explorers report electronic equipment malfunctioning in specific areas, compasses spinning randomly, and feelings of disorientation and unease that intensify in deeper sections. Electromagnetic readings taken at the site show unusual patterns, with some areas displaying field strengths that don't match ambient background levels and frequency variations that some researchers claim match brainwave entrainment patterns. The state of New York's handling of the property has been questioned by researchers. In 2002, Camp Hero was designated a state park, but large sections remain restricted. Official explanations cite environmental concerns, contamination from old military operations, structural instability in buildings and tunnels. But researchers note that cleanup and assessment have proceeded unusually slowly, that access restrictions seem excessive for standard environmental remediation, and that requests for specific information about what's being cleaned up and why are met with bureaucratic obstacles. It's the pattern seen at other sites connected to classified programs: nominal public access combined with strategic restrictions that keep investigators away from areas where evidence might exist. In 2009, a Freedom of Information Act request filed by researcher Christopher Garitano, seeking any documents related to Project Montauk or Montauk Chair, was returned with a response stating no such records exist. But FOIA requests are notoriously limited. They only surface documents that were filed under specific names and that haven't been destroyed or classified at levels exempt from disclosure. The absence of documentation doesn't prove absence of program. MKUltra itself was nearly lost to history because CIA Director Richard Helms ordered MKUltra files destroyed in 1973. Only a cache of financial records stored separately survived, allowing congressional investigators to piece together what had occurred. If Montauk was similarly sensitive, if it involved illegal experimentation on American citizens, particularly children, the logical response would be to destroy documentation and deny everything. The absence of official records is exactly what you'd expect if the allegations are true. The electromagnetic connection is where the Montauk story intersects with verifiable science. Electromagnetic fields do affect human consciousness. This isn't conspiracy theory, it's established neuroscience. Transcranial magnetic stimulation uses electromagnetic pulses to influence brain activity and is FDA approved for treating depression. Research into electromagnetic hypersensitivity has documented that some individuals experience physiological responses to electromagnetic exposure. Soviet research during the Cold War explicitly investigated using electromagnetic radiation as a weapon, leading to the Moscow signal incident where the U.S. Embassy in Moscow was bombarded with microwave radiation, causing health effects in personnel. The U.S. military's interest in non-lethal weapons has included directed energy devices, acoustic weapons, and electromagnetic pulse weapons. The idea that the military would investigate using modified radar equipment to affect human consciousness isn't far-fetched. It's the logical extension of documented weapons research. The question is whether that research was conducted at Camp Hero, whether it involved children, and whether it achieved the effects survivors describe. Dr. Nicholas Begich, a researcher into electromagnetic weapons and mind control technology, has suggested that the Montauk allegations, even if exaggerated, likely contain core truth. "We know the military was researching these areas," he stated in interviews. "We know they were willing to experiment on citizens without consent. That's documented through MKUltra, through radiation experiments, through countless declassified programs. We know they had the technology to influence consciousness electromagnetically. The only question is scale and specifics. Did they build a facility at Montauk? Did they use children? Did they achieve the effects described? Those details are debatable. But that this type of research was occurring somewhere, using methods that would now be considered war crimes, that's not debatable. That's documented fact." The connection to the Philadelphia experiment is one of the most contested aspects of the Montauk narrative. According to conspiracy lore, the USS Eldridge was subjected to an experiment in October 1943 designed to render it invisible to enemy radar using powerful electromagnetic fields. The experiment allegedly succeeded beyond expectations, causing the ship to teleport from Philadelphia to Norfolk, Virginia, and then back with catastrophic effects on crew members. Some were fused into the ship's structure. Others experienced time distortion and psychological breakdown. The Navy denies the Philadelphia experiment ever occurred, and researchers have found no credible evidence supporting the core claims. But Al Bielek, one of the Montauk whistleblowers, claimed direct involvement in both Philadelphia and Montauk, stating that the Montauk project was specifically created to continue research started in 1943. He described the Montauk chair as a direct descendant of equipment developed for the Philadelphia experiment, refined over decades to focus on consciousness manipulation rather than ship invisibility. Bielek's credibility has been thoroughly challenged. His claimed identity includes statements about time travel and age regression that strain credibility. But setting aside the most extreme claims, his core allegation is simply that electromagnetic research begun in the 1940s continued in secret, refined over decades, eventually focusing on consciousness as a target rather than physical objects. That progression is logical. If you accept that the military was researching electromagnetic effects at all, which is documented, then continued research into applications is not just possible, but probable. Whether it happened specifically as Bielek describes is unprovable, but that it happened somewhere in some form is consistent with every pattern of classified weapons development. The dark heart of the Montauk allegations isn't the technology, it's the children. Multiple alleged survivors describe being part of a deliberate program to identify psychically gifted children, isolate them from normal support systems, and subject them to psychological and physical trauma designed to shatter their personalities and create programmable assets. The methodology described matches documented ritual abuse patterns and MKUltra techniques: isolation, sensory deprivation, administration of drugs, exposure to violence and sexual abuse, creation of alternate personalities that could be triggered and controlled. Children were allegedly kept in underground facilities for days or weeks at a time, told their parents had abandoned them, subjected to scenarios designed to create maximum psychological stress. The goal was to push consciousness beyond normal limits, accessing states where psychic abilities could manifest. According to survivors, children who succeeded in the training were used repeatedly. They would be retrieved from their normal lives, taken from schools, homes, or while traveling, brought to Camp Hero for experiments, then returned with suppressed memories and time perception altered, so they didn't recognize they'd been gone. The programming included embedded commands that would cause amnesia for the experiences, surfacing only years later, if at all. Children who couldn't perform, who resisted programming, or who suffered psychological breakdown were allegedly disposed of. Several survivors reference a crematorium in the underground facility, though this has never been verified. They describe seeing other children disappear, being told they'd been reassigned or completed the program, but fearing the truth was darker. The psychological profiles of alleged Montauk survivors share common elements: complex PTSD, dissociative identity disorder, unexplained gaps in childhood memory, phobias related to institutions and authority figures, nightmares involving underground spaces and medical procedures. These symptoms are consistent with severe childhood trauma, though they don't prove the specific cause was government experimentation. Therapists who've worked with these individuals note that their presentations match other ritual abuse survivors and victims of organized child exploitation. The specificity of their memories, descriptions of technology, procedures, facility layouts, is unusual but not unprecedented in trauma narratives. Whether those memories represent literal experiences, symbolic processing of trauma, or constructed narratives built on fragmentary actual experiences, remains hotly debated in therapeutic and research communities. One particularly disturbing element across multiple accounts is description of the Montauk monster, allegedly a creature manifested through psychic projection experiments gone wrong. According to these accounts, a child in the Montauk chair was forced to visualize a large, aggressive creature, which the chair amplified until it achieved temporary physical form. The creature allegedly broke containment, killing several personnel before being subdued or dissipating. This story has been dismissed as obvious fiction, possibly inspired by the Stranger Things Demogorgon, though the Montauk allegations predate the show by decades. But multiple survivors independently reference an incident involving manifestation of something dangerous, suggesting either a real event being described symbolically, a shared programmed memory used to reinforce fear and compliance, or an actual phenomenon that participants can't process literally, and so describe in creature terms. The government's response to Montauk allegations has been consistent non-engagement. No official denial, no acknowledgement, no investigation offered. When questioned, military and intelligence spokespeople state simply that no program by that name existed, that Camp Hero was a standard radar installation, and that conspiracy theories don't merit response. This approach is standard for handling allegations about classified programs: neither confirm nor deny, allow the conspiracy label to do the work of discrediting, wait for public interest to fade. It's the same approach used for decades regarding MKUltra, until declassified documents forced acknowledgement. It's the approach used for UFO phenomena, until military acknowledgement of unidentified aerial phenomena. Non-denial doesn't prove truth, but it doesn't prove falsehood either. It simply maintains ambiguity while protecting classification. The Montauk story has been complicated by its absorption into popular culture. Stranger Things brought the name to millions who'd never heard the original allegations, but in a fictionalized form that makes the real claims seem derivative. Several books, documentaries, and websites promote Montauk theories, but with varying degrees of rigor. Some carefully researched, others sensationalized and mixed with unrelated conspiracy theories. This pollution of the narrative makes investigation harder. Serious researchers struggle to separate documented facts from elaborated fiction, to identify which witnesses are credible and which are attention-seeking. The story has become a hall of mirrors where truth, if it exists, is nearly impossible to extract from decades of embellishment. But beneath the conspiracy noise, certain facts remain uncomfortable. Camp Hero was a military installation with sophisticated electromagnetic equipment during the exact period when documented government programs were experimenting on American citizens. The facility had underground spaces, was isolated, and had security that could maintain secrecy. Multiple individuals with no apparent connection claimed similar experiences there. Local residents reported unusual activity for years. The government has never permitted thorough independent investigation of the site. And the psychological profiles of alleged survivors match documented patterns of institutional abuse. None of this proves the Montauk project occurred as described, but it provides enough foundation that dismissal without investigation seems premature. The truth about the Montauk project probably lies somewhere between the most extreme allegations and complete fabrication. The core claims that electromagnetic experimentation occurred at Camp Hero, that it involved human subjects, that children may have been among those subjects, are consistent with documented government behavior in other programs. The more extraordinary claims, successful manifestation of physical objects through psychic power, time travel, deliberate creation of portal to alternate dimensions, require evidence that hasn't been provided, and may represent symbolic description of psychological experiences rather than literal events. But the pattern is clear enough to conclude that something happened at Camp Hero beyond standard military operations. Whether it was illegal human experimentation, psychological operations testing, electromagnetic weapons development, or something else, the facility was being used for classified purposes that involved effects on human consciousness. The revelation isn't that the government conducted secret experiments. We know they did. That's documented across dozens of programs. The revelation is that those experiments likely continued far longer than officially acknowledged, that the targets included American children, and that the full scope of what was done may never be known because documentation was destroyed and survivors were programmed to suppress memories. The Montauk Project, whether or not every allegation is accurate, represents the logical endpoint of a security apparatus given unlimited classified authority, convinced that the Soviet threat justified any method, willing to sacrifice individuals for perceived collective security. That such programs existed isn't conspiracy theory, it's documented history. That Montauk specifically was one of them remains unproven but is supported by enough circumstantial evidence and witness testimony that outright dismissal requires ignoring substantial smoke, suggesting fire. The children who were allegedly taken to Camp Hero, whether dozens or hundreds, whether the experiences were as extreme as described or somewhat less dramatic, were betrayed by the institutions meant to protect them. If even a fraction of the allegations are true, then American children were subjected to psychological torture, electromagnetic exposure, and deliberate traumatization by their own government in facilities on American soil during peacetime. The damage done wasn't just individual, it was civilizational. It represented the corruption of the principle that children are off-limits, that certain lines cannot be crossed regardless of justification, and the refusal to acknowledge, investigate, or provide accountability means that damage continues, carried by survivors who can't fully heal because their experiences are dismissed as fantasy. The Montauk Project's legacy isn't the technology or even the alleged phenomena. It's the demonstration of what becomes possible when secrecy is absolute, when oversight is absent, when the ends are believed to justify any means. Whether consciousness can be manipulated electromagnetically to produce psychic effects, whether those effects can alter physical reality, whether doorways to other dimensions can be opened. These questions are almost secondary to the simpler truth. Children were hurt. Whether by conventional methods or extraordinary ones, whether as part of Montauk specifically or similar programs, children were used as experimental subjects and discarded. That should be the scandal. That should drive investigation. But instead, the story gets filed under conspiracy theory. The victims are dismissed as delusional, and the people responsible, if the allegations are true, escape accountability because the events are too extreme to be believed. The camp still stands. The radar tower still looms over Montauk Point, a concrete monolith slowly deteriorating in the salt air. Tourists visit the state park, walk along the trails, explore the visible buildings. Most have never heard of the Montauk Project. Those who have generally think of it as internet folklore, something between entertainment and delusion. The tunnels remain mostly sealed. The underground spaces, if they exist as described, sit silent and dark. And somewhere, survivors of whatever actually happened there continue carrying memories that the world insists cannot be real. They live with trauma that has no official cause, seeking healing for experiences that are officially fiction. They watch shows like Stranger Things and feel a complex mix of vindication, someone believed enough to tell a story, and despair because the story being told is safely fictional, allowing the real events to remain safely denied. The question that should haunt us isn't whether the Montauk Project achieved psychic manifestation or time travel. The question is why we're more willing to debate impossible phenomena than to investigate documented patterns of government abuse. Why extraordinary claims receive attention while ordinary evil, the simple fact of children being harmed by institutions, gets dismissed. The Montauk story survives because it offers mystery, because it promises hidden knowledge and suppressed truth. But the real truth might be simpler and darker. that in pursuit of weapons and advantage during the Cold War, limits were ignored, children were hurt, and when those children tried to tell what had been done to them, they were silenced by a wall of official denial and popular incredulity. That's not science fiction. That's history. And whether it happened specifically at Camp Hero or at similar facilities elsewhere, it represents a wound in American trust that has never healed because it's never been acknowledged. Tonight, the wind off the Atlantic sweeps across Montauk Point, rattling fences around Camp Hero, whistling through broken windows of abandoned buildings. The radar tower stands silent, a monument to surveillance and secrets. And beneath the earth, if the stories are true, corridors and chambers remain, filled with the echoes of what occurred there. Perhaps nothing more than Cold War military research, perhaps something darker. The truth, like so much from that era, remains classified, denied, and effectively untouchable. We make shows about fictional experiments. We watch them as entertainment. And the real experiments, the real children, the real suffering, if it existed, remains safely categorized as conspiracy, too extreme to investigate, too disturbing to acknowledge. That's the real horror of the Montauk Project, not what might have happened in the underground, but what continues to happen above it. The willful refusal to look, to ask, to demand answers. Because some truths, once confirmed, can't be ignored. And a government that experimented on children is a truth we might not be ready to face.